You now know how to work with the controls needed to create almost any online form. One thing that you'll often need to do with online forms is to validate the user's input to make sure that they are entering everything correctly. Although you could validate user input using a combination of C# and JavaScript code, ASP.NET provides a series of controls that will automatically generate the validation code for you. The RequiredFieldValidator control is one of these controls. To begin this lesson, open the Shining Stone sample file from your Sample Files folder. And open buy.aspx in Design View. This is the form that a visitor to the site would use to buy a product. It isn't finished yet, and one thing that it needs is validation. You're going to add a RequiredFieldValidator control to this page. You'll find it in the Validation category of the toolbox. Drag a RequiredFieldValidator control from the toolbox and drop it just after the Address 1 text box. A RequiredFieldValidator control simply makes sure that the user has entered something into the control that it validates. In this case, you're going to make it validate that some text has been entered into the TextBox Address 1 control. Start by setting its ID property to RequiredFieldValidator Address 1. Then set its text property to star. This is the message that will appear if the user doesn't fill in the field. Finally, set the Control to Validate property to TextBox Address 1. The Control to Validate property tells the validator which control it is going to check. Before continuing, I'd just like to draw your attention to the Validation Group property. You already know that an ASP.NET page is implemented using one and only one HTML form that typically includes all page content. This can cause a problem with validation. Imagine that you had a login section at the top of your web page containing username and password fields. When the user tried to log in on this page, validation would fail because address 1 was left blank. Validation groups solve this problem. All validation controls have a validation group property, which is blank by default. This means that, by default, all controls belong to the same validation group. If you wish to associate some form controls with a particular button, such as associating the username and password fields with a login button, you would set the validation group property of these controls to the same value. When the user clicked the login button,